The Story of the Queen, Mrs. Thalia Outlaw. A Butterfly in Captivity, Part 1. Mrs. Outlaw was sentenced to life in jail in an absurd so-called trial that lasted only 24 hours. Mrs. Outlaw had filed 16 reports of domestic violence against her ex-boyfriend. Mrs. Outlaw was stalked, burned, and beaten repeatedly by her stalker. In fact, her stalker beat her son on an occasion, and her elderly father. Mrs. Outlaw, a tiny woman of only 5 feet tall, was 3 months pregnant at the time of the incident. The day of the incident, Mrs. Outlaw was attacked by her ex-boyfriend and was slashed multiple times with a knife, and to this day still has the scars to prove it. Her attacker punched her in her stomach, repeatedly saying he was going to kill her and her unborn child. Mrs. Outlaw fought back. There was a struggle with the knife, and her attacker fell back over a chair and sustained a self-inflicted wound to the clavicle area. The attacker's friends who were present broke up the fight, and her attacker left, driving himself to the hospital. Mrs. Outlaw drove to the police station to file her 16th report against her ex-boyfriend. Her attacker died at the hospital from a single wound to his clavicle area, and Mrs. Outlaw was subsequently arrested for murder. Mrs. Outlaw was released and assured by detectives she had nothing to worry about and that it was self-defense. Mrs. Outlaw gave birth to her daughter Octavia and was rebuilding her life with her 2 sons. 18 months after the incident, Mrs. Outlaw was brought to trial. A jury was selected on this date. Stay tuned for Part 2.